I released a form of this map like a year and a half ago, and people since then have really wanted me to make a video explaining why I made these what appear to be pretty strange border predictions for the world in 100 years. Well, here it is. This is a video to go through the borders of every continent to explain what I think they'll be like in the year 2120. So without ado, let's get started. A couple times I've wondered what's exactly the product that would pander to Wodafaltist fans the best. Well, I think I found it. Bismarck Analysis is a consulting firm that helps with companies, governments, philanthropists, and the like advance our collective civilization. They're aligned with Wodafaltists and the goals of helping our society through the crisis that we're about to face with all the wisdom we'll need. Like Wodafaltists, they try to look at the historical trends that result in the rise and fall of civilizations, and then project them forwards into the future. They also have an incredible brief that you can start reading for free, which covers the exact same topics as Wodafaltists that I recommend you check out. Some examples of their latest productions are France is Europe's best shot at rearmament, Russia's rapid reforms bring military theory into practice, and Gates Foundation blind spot. Their writing and thought is top-notch. If you want to dig deeper into topics I've covered in Wodafaltist, Bismarck is really the first place you should go. I'm good friends with the CEO, and we're working on a coordinated Wodafaltist Bismarck video right now. Click the link in the description to start using Bismarck today. Something I want to remind this audience about is that this map isn't gospel, and I'm not certain the world will turn out like this. It's often funny for me when my fans take this map and other maps I make more seriously than I do, and this map is a series of implicit assumptions that I think will be correct, but could easily be wrong. For more information on what the assumptions I'm making are, you should check out this video on the 4 trajectories of the 21st century. As an example, I make the assumption that one group of humans won't genetically engineer themselves into superhuman status and gain world domination, or runaway climate change doesn't occur. Both of these are within the range of possibility, however. Or I've heard compelling arguments both for greater centralization and greater decentralization in the future, and I'm frankly not sure what side will win, and so I created a midway scenario here. As I always say, I'm betting against God here, and there are infinite ways to be wrong with predictions and only a handful to be right. With that out of the way, let's get started. Part 1. North America. Canada is the most confusing and complicated part of this map. In a previous rendition of the script, just explaining the Canadian section took a tremendous amount of the video, but luckily enough, since then, I've made a video about the potential future of Canada. Click the link to that video for more details. The long and short of it, however, is that Canada is a loose confederacy of various provinces with very different self-interests, and these provinces build various coalitions and arrangements in order to keep Canada a unified country. However, I think that due to a combination of a crisis in Canada's identity and very different demographic trends with aging between the western and eastern provinces of Canada means that the ideologically more conservative and aligned with the U.S. western prairie provinces will want to join America at the middle of the century. Looking at cycles across American history, the U.S. will likely be going through a golden age at the middle of the century, meaning this will look very attractive, while at the same time, Eastern Canada would be going through horrific aging, thus depressing its economy. Once the prairie provinces go, the tapestry of alliances that holds Canada together starts to fray. Quebec, the French-speaking province that continually nearly secedes, leaves Canada if anything remotely stressful happens. Likewise, if these two regions leave, it means British Columbia, which is culturally and economically distinct from the rest of Canada and the US, as an independent country. The Maritimes cut off from Quebec joins the US, while Ontario, the proudest Canadian province, remains independent and becomes wealthy based off exploiting loopholes in the US legal code due to its central geography. I don't agree with the modern consensus that the US is really in decline as a superpower, at least not the fall of Rome that so many pessimists believe. I think the US is becoming the next Roman Empire in a real sense, and will experience several gold ages and dark times across the next century, with the current period being one. I think the problems the US is facing now are comparable to the struggles of the late Roman Republic or the Russian Revolution, and is a short period of failure before the US goes through another period of strength. However, this map underplays America's strength since the US will almost certainly dominate the colonization of space, which isn't on this map of Earth. Meanwhile, when looking at Central America and the Caribbean, we're largely looking at how things are now. Realistically, if you look at a map of the world based off countries that the US has as allies, it looks very different than a worldview based just off sovereign official borders. Basically, every country in this area is a US satellite or ally. However, I think this process will be expedited and helped by the assimilation of Hispanic Americans, which is already occurring very quickly. Imagine how much it would help American-Latin relations in a country where many prosperous American states are plurality Hispanic, and Hispanics have gained significant political influence, maybe even with a Hispanic president. What's often normal is that former communist countries become very capitalist upon getting out from the boot of their normally hated communist ruling parties and become capitalist since they know how bad communism is. I see this process happening in Cuba. I think Cuba will become the wealthiest country in Latin America, also due to its proximity to the US and the wealthy and influential Cuban American community in Florida, which would probably flood money into Cuba to modernize it. Part 2, South America. I don't see a lot of border changes in South America. As I said before in a previous video, South America has actually been hurt in some ways by its borders making too much sense, in that in almost all cases, South American countries are built around fertile heartlands surrounded by impassable jungles, deserts, or mountains in the fringes. This is a blessing in making this unusually peaceful continent, but also means there's never competition or pressure to really improve between countries. I also don't see Latin America really having a big industrial push outside the areas bordering the US, since this area really hasn't moved forward economically as compared to the rest of the world in 300 years. The US allies here are the ones the US largely has now. I'm adding Venezuela for the exact reason I see Cuba becoming an American ally. The future of Venezuela as a society is largely dictated by whether they can get their act together before or after we switch away from a predominantly oil economy, if we do. The only border shift I could see is that the wealthy, white, and culturally distinct southern Brazil splits off from the rest of the Brazil in the crisis of the third world that I anticipate in the next few decades, in which central Brazilian power will become autocratic and weak. I would see them align themselves with the white southern cone of US allies that exists in the region like Uruguay, Argentina, or Chile. Part 3. Europe. I have a complicated multi-step view of what Europe's future will be that I'll cover in more detail in some future video. However, I think the US is going through a crisis of identity that will result in the US pulling back from Europe, which the US will ostensibly have little reason to protect. However, I don't think either party realizes how necessary the Americans are to the functioning of the modern European order. At the same time, Europe will be experiencing a demographic and aging crisis that will rip their societies apart. I think this crisis will humble Europe, which will now have to painfully realize it is no longer the center of the world that it was 100 years ago. The Americans will then return to Europe as America's population remains stable while Europe's is rapidly collapsing. The Europeans, who have seen many horrors between collapsing economies, civil wars, external wars, and the like, will then acquiesce to greater American influence, who will gradually colonize Europe in a process that I don't think either will consciously view as colonization, as various European countries are gradually weakened into forming a pan-European confederacy under American guidance. The explanation for this is too long, and so I made it a text wall, but I think the comparison to the Greeks and Romans is very apt, in which the Romans tried to liberate the Greeks from the Macedonians, and then the Romans, who greatly respected the Greeks, tried various self-governance schemes for the region, only to realize that Greek civilization was in active decline, and as the Greeks continually failed, the Romans gradually took over the area. For more details, I would check out the book The Coming Caesars by Amaury de Riencourt, which looks at the parallels between the Greeks and the Romans and modern Europeans and Americans in a very compelling way. As Europe becomes less a place of power and more a museum of declining nations, borders will change to make sense to more geographically and ethnically based, rather than based off some war in the 18th century. Ethnically split nations like Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland will likely split or become part of their co-ethnic nations. Likewise, the UK likely divide with Scotland splitting off, partially driven by the decline of Britain from great power, and as religion becomes less of a sticking point, Ireland will unify. As transportation has gotten a lot faster since the Industrial Revolution, countries like Slovakia, the Baltics, and Scandinavia will form confederacies with their co-ethnics to gain more leverage and power in a world of bigger countries. As Europe becomes weaker and more inside the American sphere of influence, I think the Americans will buy Greenland off the Danes. Greenland is central to missile warfare, and as the world warms, will probably become the center of the Arctic trade routes, thus making it extremely strategically important for the US. Due to the collapse of belief in the shared Russian mission as a nation alongside their massive demographic collapse, I don't think Russia or the Balkans will survive. For a bunch of reasons, I'm bullish on Turkey as a future superpower, and with the Balkans experiencing the fastest population collapses of anywhere in the world, often losing half their population over the next few decades, I see the populous Muslim world just moving settlers into the Balkans and Crimea, turning them into cultural extensions of the Middle East. I also see similar trends in the Christian Caucasus nations like Armenia and Georgia, which are under very similar demographic and cultural circumstances. The US doesn't have a lot of cultural or strategic interests in the Balkans, and would allow this to happen when distracted elsewhere, but we would see a frontier develop between Christian and Muslim worlds at the edge of the Hungarian plain around modern Belgrade, which is the natural geographic choke point. With the collapse of Russia, I see two powers gaining more influence in the void that Russia leaves in Eastern Europe, the Poles and the Turks. I see the Poles expanding east, seizing Belarus and western Ukraine, which will become a buffer state between Turkish, Russian, and Western influence. I see the Turks gaining dominance over the Black Sea, as they have for most of the modern period, using Crimea as a detached peninsula with a large Muslim minority as an airbase to control the region from. I see them allying with Russia's Muslim minority populations that they often have a good amount of cultural connection with, like the Chechens and Tatars, who have the highest birth rates of anyone in Russia, and will only get more populous over time as Russia's, especially Orthodox Christian population, collapses. The Turks might possibly split off the somewhat culturally distinct southern grassland of Russia called Chernozem as a buffer. Depending on how much the mission of a unified Russia has failed at this point, Chernozem might continually attempt to join up with the fragment of what used to be Russia. Also, spoilers for a future video, I think there's a decent chance that a new civilization develops in this area. Part 4. Africa. There are two trends you need to understand to figure out the Africa you see on this map. The first is that I think the Muslim world will industrialize and become wealthy. This is because that region of the world has commonly been wealthy across history, as well as it's the only major one of the four Eurasian civilizations that hasn't industrialized. Even so, we've already seen a precedent of industrialization in Turkey and Iran, which will probably set a precedent for the rest of the Muslim world. However, you see no such similar trend for Black Africa, which has none of the preconditions for industrialization. Thus, when you see this mega Morocco, you're looking at what happens when an industrialized Muslim country sees the opportunity to conquer a technologically inferior region. This is keeping with the Moroccan tradition of invading West Africa that's happened a couple times, and is also tenable since it's pretty easy to build highways across the Sahara for communication, with the Moroccans creating a second empire across the Sahara and the Sahel. Likewise, I see a similar trend with Turkish influence taking place in Sudan and Northeast Africa. The second dominant trend is that the state doesn't have a strong record in this region of the world and was largely created by Europeans for their own colonial purposes without dealing with local conditions. At the same time, most African nations haven't been able to construct strong national identities, with their governments often being rackets for one ethnic group to extract payments from the others. I call the era since World War II the UN Bretton Woods era, given that it's been an alliance of American power with UN politics to basically keep nation-states operating even when they have no coherent reason to. This system used to make more sense when most of the third world countries were inhabited by underpopulated peasant communities, but as the third world became more urbanized, literate, populated, and wealthy, political organizations will have to change to represent their identities more. After Asia, Africa is the top region in the world where I expect atrocities and mass death this century, since it's largely the only region that's having ludicrous population growth, which is the big driver for atrocities. Projections show Africa will have 3 to 4 times China's population, or past 4 billion, by the end of the century, which makes no sense, and so there really has to be a big crisis. I see the old African order collapsing and being replaced by a lot of chaos. I see a laboratory of various warlords, theocracies, and crypto states. I think this degree of competition will actually be amazing for the continent and its future history, since it will create massive pressures towards improvement in creating African civilizations. Sort of like how modern Western civilization was formed in the chaos that came after the fall of Rome. I mean, the main geographic problems that kept Africa in poverty until recently are largely gone, so if Africa can formulate a way to wealth, they can achieve it. However, I think there are a couple exceptions to this rule, the first of which is ethnically coherent or resource-bearing territories on the coast that I'm pretty sure would survive and form as coherent nation-states. One is the Igbo in Nigeria, who could export their oil or the oil-bearing mouth of the Congo River, which would become a hub of trade. Finally, Cape Town, which has always been a city-state that's belonged to every continent, I see splitting off as an American ally. Similarly, whenever you get chaotic data sets, you always have a couple outliers. Or in other words, when you get a lot of little crazy states, you'll end up with a couple large empires run by geniuses that dominate their regions, just off statistical chance. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few places that doesn't have a long history of preformed civilization and cultural boundaries, meaning that this region has the potential for great Charlemagnes, Harun al-Rashids, or George Washingtons who could form whole new civilizations. Although, in all fairness, this state could develop anywhere in Africa, I'm putting a bet on East Africa, which has largely seen the best leadership in Africa so far, some of the best nation building, and also the formations of what could be the East African Union, or a federation of Kenya, Tanzania, South Sudan, Rwanda, and Burundi, who plan on forming a unified country. I honestly don't have really high hopes for this working, but of any one place in Africa, I have the highest hopes of this region becoming the empire. As the rest of Africa might spiral into war, neighboring areas would seek protection under the East African Union, with a notable example being the resource-rich southeastern province of Katanga in the Democratic Republic of Congo that would sell its resources east through the Indian Ocean rather than west through Kinshasa as it does now. The final spot is Ethiopia, which I think would be the main competitor to form an African empire alongside the East African Union. Ethiopia is the only main country in sub-Saharan Africa to industrialize and also is the main one that has a large history of a strong state before European colonization. I put Ethiopia as one of the leading contenders for a future African empire. Part 5. Asia. The main trend that I see borne out in Asia over this next century is closing the technological gap that Western civilization has had over the last 500 years. In a lot of ways, this is pulling us back into the Middle Ages, in which countries that have had long-standing geopolitical, demographic, or strategic advantages since the time of Marco Polo will again gain dominance over their civilizations. Starting in the West, I've already talked about the Turks a bit in their other continents. In short, there's a reason the Turks have dominated the Middle East for almost all of the last 1,000 years. They have cultural, geographic, and military advantages over the dispossessed Arabs. I think as oil will probably become less important, the Middle East will revert to the large empires that have ruled it for thousands of years, with the Turks and Iranians being the obvious contenders. I think the Turks will win in a conflict against the Iranians, like they've done the last several times, due to their greater wealth, technological progress, population, and sharing Sunni identity with most of the area. The Turks are largely surrounded by failed states, so this is easier than you'd think. I see the Turks establishing a series of client states outside their direct sphere of influence, in places like Oman, the Hejaz, and Libya. One of the most fraught decisions I've struggled with in this map was whether Israel would survive. On one hand, if the Muslim world industrializes, Israel is dead, since it's so hated by the surrounding Muslims. However, the Jews are a stubborn people that are hard to kill, and I see the Turks, who have a history of multi-ethnic empires and cooperating with the Jews, in effect working with the Jews to keep down the Arab subjects of their empire. However, another point of view is that the Israelis also might be able to create an effective Arab coalition that keeps the Turkish Empire from forming in the first place. I see the ethnic Turkish states in Central Asia becoming allies of the Turkish nation due to their cultural reasons. I redrew the borders here to fit more around actual ethnic borders in the region because, as of now, the borders of Central Asia were literally designed by Stalin to screw over any future independent countries. These areas will probably become wealthy and central to the world economy as Asia becomes wealthy and the old Silk Road trade centers grow up again. If the Islamic world industrializes, we will also get the second pole of the Middle East. Iran seize power. The countries to Iran's east, like Afghanistan or Pakistan, are largely artificial, unstable, and created for political reasons, and I don't see them surviving. Under those conditions, we would return to the previous situation in which Persia would have a large sphere of cultural influence and allies in the Afghan mountains, but would leave these geographically tough and unruly regions to their own practical self-governance. I think India will go through a period of painful, intense politics over the next few decades before becoming wealthier, working off the chip on their shoulder from British colonialism, and then move on to becoming the stable, isolationist civilization they've been for the last 4,000 years. I don't see Bangladesh or Pakistan as successful states, and so think that as India continues to grow and get richer, that India will suck in both into their economic and then afterwards cultural and political order. As India mellows out and asks to work with Muslim territories, will start to construct its identity around the shared Indic civilization rather than Hinduism. Burma, which is the rice bowl for this region and geographically and culturally connected to the broader Indic world, will also probably end up in the orbit and as an ally to a mature and wealthy India. The main reason I have China eat so much of Siberia and Central Asia is just sheer demographics. The whole of Siberia and Central Asia combined has a population of less than 100 million, while China has a population of 1.5 billion. The thing that's kept the Chinese from populating and settling these areas, many of which can support far more people. I mean, the Chinese side of the border is 200 million people and the Russian is 4, than they do today, is a combination of how the Chinese were militarily inferior to the native inhabitants of these areas who were nomads, and Russian power, both of which are going to go away. I also have much of East Asia join the Chinese orbit, since as China industrializes, it will force these countries into inextricably close economic cooperation. The main thing that keeps these countries from being Chinese allies is that the Communist Party is cruel and morally corrupt. However, in a lot of ways, the Communist Chinese Party is a deviant from most of Chinese history, in which regimes have generally been pretty honorable and not too expansionist. At the same time, Japan and Korea have been Chinese allies for most of their histories, and have a switch that basically allows them to switch allegiance to whoever happens to be the most powerful country at the time, which is how they've been able to so successfully take up Western culture. What I think will happen is that as China collapses into its warlord period, the Communist Party will become more totalitarian and cruel. Then we'll move over to the warlord period, and as a reaction against the Communist Party, I think we'll have a nationalist and socially conservative China, but also one that's relatively honorable, and so all the nations in the area would be willing to work with China. Finally, I see the collapse of Indonesia, which is again one of the most fraught decisions I've made here. Indonesia really doesn't make a lot of sense as a country both geographically and culturally, but the Indonesians have done a pretty good job of constructing a national identity over the 20th century. And that's not something I covered about in my videos of countries that will collapse, but I do think it's important. I consider the survival of Indonesia a toss-up depending on whatever the leadership involved is. I have the region split here between Chinese and American proxies, with the Americans supporting Java, the most populated island close to Australia, and the Chinese supporting Borneo and Sumatra and other islands that largely view Java as their oppressor, and also they'd sell goods to the Chinese economy. What a faultist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pearl, Patreon, or Pillar, as well as my social media. As always, it's been a pleasure, and have a great day.